Right. So this will just be a brief overview of social network analysis and how it can be useful for people from the other side of the equation, the natural scientists. Now, I've used social network analysis using a package that used to be available for freeware, and it's called Cytoscape. But a couple of months ago, they suddenly started charging people for using it. So I haven't used it in R, but it's available in R, and it's obviously free, like everything else in R. So I'm now going to start using it in R because I can no longer use the free package. So it's one of those things that actually encourages you to use R because of that exact reason. So yes, I'm talking about social network analysis. Now, I know that most of you are not social scientists, but I'm going to try and make it relevant to why it's nice to know about it and how you can use it in the biophysical sciences. So there's lots of physical networks that we have in the world. Rivers, the systems within our bodies, the blood networks, the internet, road networks, anything. These are called what I refer to as physical networks. And then we have interaction networks. So a lot of the social side of things looks at interaction networks. These are not between people, but these interaction networks are the World Wide Web, the trade. So I used social network analysis to look at the trade in quota between fishermen and how that changed over time. So it's basically an interaction, whether it's a trade, a communication, a relationship, anything that happens between two entities or two people. Also, food webs are, importantly, are interaction networks. One animal eats another animal. So there's analogies. So just looking at social networks, how many people have heard of the 6 degrees of separation thing? Almost everyone, right? So the 6 degrees of separation thing really somehow sparked an interest in how we are related to each other, and the fact that just in this particular summer school, I knew someone that someone else knew that someone else knew. It always happens wherever you go. The world is big and there's more than 7 billion people, but somehow we're all connected. I won't talk more about the 6 degrees of separation, but it's a really interesting story that you should read up on how they actually got to that. So social networks are relationships between people, whether it's friendships, acquaintances, kinships, as in family relationships, whether it's the relationships between people, between organisations, so you can have the relationships between NGOs, between scientists, any relationship between people is a social network. And I'll give you some examples of some social networks, but first of all I wanted to just say that there's, as I already mentioned, there's an increasing interest in social network analysis. There's been a bit of explosion in terms of both the methods that we can use and the sorts of analysis we can do, but as you can see by the number of abstracts, it's a growing area of interest. So one of the applications that I thought was quite interesting is you won't see the detail, but what they did with after the 9/11 attack, they basically built up the network of the people involved in the attack, and they found some really interesting relationships between them. And from that network, they could tell that everyone was related to 2 key people in that network in the middle there. Or they were only 2 steps away from that person in that network. So you can look at you can ask interesting questions about who is important to approach in terms of, for instance, a terrorist cell. I keep wanting to push that one. Another application was this network that is between different climate scientists in Hawaii. So what they did is to look at who talked to who about climate science, to see who they should target and how they should target their science communication. So as it turns out, this is between different cultures, and basically people within their own culture talk to the people within their own culture. So to actually try and break those networks apart a little bit, to get people to talk to the people in Hawaii, to talk to the people in India, and the people in India to talk to the people in Australia, is something that needs to happen within the climate sciences. Now, this is admittedly only in Hawaii, but it can tell you something about how should you approach a problem. So, just coming to the interdisciplinary thinking about networks, that what can the biologists, in a way, or the marine biologists, learn from social network analysis? Well, the social scientists have really got a grip on what the meaning of the structure of the network is, what it is about the topology of the network that can tell you something about what's happening, how information flows, and what are the critical points. So that's all I'll be looking at today in this short presentation, is about the topology, and give you a flavour of how you might be able to use it in your own discipline. So the structural equivalence, as they call it, of the social network is basically has an analogy to the trophic roles in a network. So you can use it for to study habitat fragmentation and to look at what the ecological roles of different species are in different communities. So getting away from the biology again, I'm afraid that this is an example of the different topology of a network and what the meaning of that is. So these are two pictures of electricity grids in the United States. The first, on the left-hand side, it's almost like a true grid. It's like that. Whereas the second one it looks a little bit messy. But if you look in terms of what would happen if one of those the central electricity providers would disappear, the connections between the others would still remain intact. Whereas in that second picture, if you take out that electricity provider in that state over there, a lot would happen. So if you're someone that wants to tamper with the American electricity grid, obviously you would target that particular instance or that particular location. Similarly, if you have a food web, if you take out one of the top predators, you can figure out what might happen to the rest of the network. Similarly, if you take out one of the lower ones, what might happen up and down, you can assess that as well. So now I'm going to get into some of this is going to be very basic. It just give you a taster to see if you might want to use it, and you can come and talk to me afterwards. But basically, the structure of the network is underpinned by a simple matrix algebra, right? You have an undirected network where if A is connected to B, then automatically B is connected to A. And you have a directed network. So if A, or in that example, number C is connected to B, but B is not connected to A. So that might be a trade or something like that, where C sells to B, but B doesn't sell to A. So that is reflected in the matrices down below. So the things about the structure of the network that are interesting is really the connectivity, which is quite simple. It's basically, are you connected or not, the probability of being connected to someone else. But we're really interested in the centrality measure, like who in the network actually plays what sort of role and who's important, who's central to that network. So that's what the latter is what I'll be focusing on. But in order to do that, we just need to understand how you would go about calculating that. So basically, I call them actors. People call them nodes. People call them all sorts of things. And the connections between them, they're called edges or paths or connections, basically. There's lots of names for those different things. But basically, if we start at A, we can see that they're one step away from 4 others in the network. They're 2 steps away from 5 others. A is 3 steps away from 4 others, etc., etc. So this is a measure of distance, right? So A is 5 steps away from number 1, or from the last one. So in this network, you could figure out how many steps people are away. But as you can see, there's some people down below who are not in the central component of that network. So there's small networks that are shown down below. So this particular group of people, only that top one are fully connected in that large component, whereas those small ones are just trading with each other, for instance. So they're separate components. Now, this is best illustrated by the way a network works is very well illustrated by an example from Colorado Springs University. A is it a university or a college? I don't know. But basically what they did is they figured out, they looked, over 4 years, they looked at the romantic relationships people had with each other. And they looked at 695 people in that network. And basically what they found is that there were some key people in the network that had romantic relationships with a lot of others. Whereas the keystone species, that's right. But when I saw this, I couldn't believe it. This is 4 years of romantic relationships. That's quite an active group, I suppose. So, yes. So basically, that's an interesting way that you look. But this is also an interesting way that you can look at disease spread, right? If you have a romantic relationship, you can think about how many people would have to be infected to spread it to the whole network. So that's one example of how that's used. So the 3 measures of the topology of the network that we like to use is degree centrality, closeness centrality, and betweenness centrality. So centrality, people in their minds always think, okay, that's something that's in the middle. But in this context of networks, it's not necessarily something that's in the middle. It's something that someone is in the middle of a flow of information in terms of they bind the network together. And so I'll show you these 3 measures or statistics that show you how to interpret a network. So degree centrality is very simple. Basically, it counts the number of ties that you have. So in that star-shaped network, the middle person has 7 ties, so his degree centrality is 7. In that more complicated network in the middle, each one of the actors, aside from the outside ones, has 3 connections. In the circular network, there's 2 connections, and in the bottom one, besides the outside ones, there's everyone has 2 connections except for those. Now, when you look at that one, you think, well, the person in the middle has got to be the most important, but in terms of their degree centrality, they're not. It's actually those people in those smaller clusters that are more important in terms of their degree centrality, the number of connections that they have. So by just looking at a network, you don't always take the right conclusion. Closeness centrality is the distance from each other, or it's closely related to that, and it's probably best illustrated through the example here. So in that first example, it only takes, the closeness centrality is 1, because it only takes 1 step to get to all the other people in the network. If that middle person had a disease, it would only take 1 step for all the other people to get a disease as well. In that circular one, centrality, the closeness centrality is 0 for the network, not for the individual people. So you can calculate, and I should have turned that on, but you can calculate the closeness centrality for the network and for the individual people, right? And so this one, basically, the quickest to spread from the middle node is, or that right-hand network, the closeness centrality for the network is 0.36, whereas the bottom one is 0.28. So that one is still quicker. Things would spread quicker in that far right one than they would in the bottom one. Yeah? So that's the second measure of centrality of a network. And then there's betweenness centrality. And that's about people who lie on the communication paths. So for B to get information to A, or to the rest of the group, they'd have to go through the middle, right? So that's the sort of principle of betweenness centrality. They have to go through A. So in this example here, the betweenness centrality for the person in the middle of that star network is 1, because everyone has to go through this person. Whereas the betweenness centrality for the far right network is 0.59 for the whole network. But as you can see, that person has a high betweenness centrality because almost every part of that network has to go through that person. Similarly, this one, the centralisation of that network is lower than that one, so things would move slower from one side of the network to the other. But again, this person's betweenness centrality is high. Not quite as high as that one in that other network. So those measures will give you an indication of the shape, of the topology of the network. So if you look at that, which one would you think would have the highest betweenness centrality that everyone has to go through? I would think, if you look at it, just the shape of the network, you think it's the middle one. But in fact, it's not. So you can look at a network and think the shape of the network says that that one's that everyone, the flow of the information has to go through that particular person, but in this case it's not. It's actually these individuals here that have a higher betweenness centrality than the others. So they're more important in terms of the information flow. So just the centrality measure for the graph as a whole, the degree decentralization scores tells you something about the number of connections in the network. I might just skip over this one because this is really the most interesting bit. So if you think about a network and centralized and the centrality scores, we've had three, right? We had the high degree, the degree centrality, the closeness centrality, and betweenness centrality. So normally if you think about a network, you think that they're all related, but it's actually the bits where they're not all correlated that are the interesting bits. So for instance, if you look at the first column that have a low degree, so a person has not many connections, they have a low degree centrality, but they have a high closeness centrality. So this means that this is a key player that has not many ties to other players, but it's very active. It's but they are tied. The few ties that he does have are to really important persons. So that's an interesting spot to be in a network because you have a little bit of control. So similarly, if you don't have very many connections but you have a high betweenness centrality, then this person again has few ties, but they're crucial for the information to flow through the network because they hold a crucial position in that regard. Similarly, if you have a high degree, so you have lots and lots of connections, but you have low closeness, that means that it's basically this person's central, they have lots of connections, but they're in a cluster that's way, way away from the main part of the network. And similarly, if they have a high degree, so lots of connections, but they have low betweenness, then again, they may be redundant because a lot of the information goes past them. So they're interesting. The interest is really where those things don't match up. So that can tell you something about your network. So this all applies to your food webs and stuff as well. So any biophysical network where you want to understand the topology of the network, this is a really nice way to look at it. So just summarising. So the social network analysis has created a really nice, rich set of measures by which you can look at a network and understand something from the topology of the network. And you can use it to indicate flows and the quantities of information or food or whatever goes through the network. And it's already being applied in, I mean, obviously the biological sciences have looked at food webs for a long time, but some of the principles that have come out of the social sciences are looking at understanding the behaviour of groups better. So it's been used by entomologists. It's also been used to understand behavioural strategies in groups. So they looked at these different zebra species that basically have different behaviours when they're at night and at day, when they're foraging and when they're sleeping. So they're trying to understand how they behave in these groups at the different times of the day. They've been used to understand seasonal changes in social bonds in primates. Social network analysis is used in primates a lot. And I just wanted to give one marine example. It's been used in bottlenose dolphins to look at where the dolphins fit in the social network structure. To actually, they found some behavioural characteristics that they did. So if they were central to the network, they actually did different signalling behaviour with their tails, etc., because they were leaders of the group. So they could tell just by looking at the behaviour of the dolphin, where it would fit in the herd network. Is it a herd of a dolphin, or is it a pod? Of course, it's a pod. Gosh, I'm a social scientist. Yeah, I know. Thank you. So, yeah. So as I said, it just gives you a taste through of social network analysis and what you could do with it in terms of the studies that you're doing. I'll leave it at that. And any questions are welcome.
Yes. The question is social network analysis all about static networks or are temporal dynamics also considered?
Yep.
That is, when I think of modeling a physical network, I know that over time for each node I have some quantity that should be conserved, being mass or electrical charge or whatever.
Yep.
Is there any equivalent for social networks?
Yep. So I've personally looked at a time series of trade data, for instance. So I looked at the structure of the network and the change of the structure over network over time. So you can actually use the statistical indicators that you can get from the network to pick up change of the structure. So a lot of networks, for instance, if you think about a lot of social and economic phenomena, there's, say, for instance, 80% of the people has 20% of the wealth, right? So that's your distribution that you often see, a scale-free distribution. So what we saw with a market that was where there was no market before and suddenly people started trading, eventually the network ended up being that distribution. 20% of the trade, or 80% of the trade happened by 20% of the processors, for instance. So we looked at how that structure of the network changed over that trade data time. So you can use those indicators to pick up change, definitely. Yeah.
Have you heard anything about the Jiffy software?
Jiffy? No. Is that used for social network analysis or a network?
It's used for visualization of the graphs. It's open source and it also provides some measurements.
Okay.
On your matrices of the links.
It.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, if you have a web link to it or something, if anyone's interested here, if you wouldn't mind sharing that, that'd be fantastic. Yeah. But yeah, I'm hoping to start using R for obvious reasons. So, plug for R. Thank you.